Greetings, friends. My name is Reggie Williams, and I am speaking to you from Flossmoor, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. I'm assistant professor of Christian ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. And my dear friend, your professor, Dr. Ron Sanders, has asked me to record this video and send it to you all, or actually he would send it to you all, as you're beginning a unit here on racism. So, without further ado, let's talk about racism. When talking about this very difficult subject, it's good to know what we mean by the word racism and what we do not mean. I think in this 10-minute segment with you, 10 or less, we will define the terms that are used and tossed around when people are talking about racism. It's often the case that when people say racism, they're misusing the word or the concept. For example, what's going on with the immigration crisis from Syria and so on. People are using the word the word racism when they actually mean xenophobia. And xenophobia is a word spelled with an X, Xenophobia, is fear or hatred of foreigners. That's not racism. To hate or fear foreigners is akin to something like a tribalism, where people who are different than us raise our suspicions really high, and we don't like them around. We shut our doors, or we want them out of our community, and their difference is frightening. That's different than racism. Fear or hatred of others, or foreigners, fear or hatred of foreigners is not racism. That's xenophobia. Also, when people mix the language of prejudice and racism, prejudice is not racism. To prejudge someone is not to be a racist. Now, racism can include prejudice, but prejudice is not racism. In his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman has a chapter on hate that offers us a definition of a four-part definition of prejudice. He tells a story of a woman meeting him, a white woman meeting him on a train. He's an African American. And this book was written in the 40s, by the way, 1940s. He's from Florida. So he's on a train. It's an African-American man. The white woman meets him. She's taking her seat. She sees him, and she's frustrated that he's there. She asks the conductor, "What is that doing here?" And the conductor says, "That has a first-class ticket." She walks around the train, talking to other people, pointing to this African-American man. This is the wrong thing, of course, that this African-American is black person, and she's not using the language that we would use, black person or African-American. She's using a pejorative N-word, is on the train with us. Shouldn't we do something about this? This is an awful thing. Well, what he describes, what has happened in this moment, is prejudice. And one might argue very racist as well. But he goes on to describe prejudice. Prejudice begins with something that he describes as contact without fellowship. This is number one. We have contact with people on a regular basis, yet we have no more relationship beyond that initial contact. In our communities, people have contact with Mexican immigrants in various ways, whether that may be when I was in school, what they do for work in our community puts us in contact with them on a regular basis. Contact without fellowship. That leads to the second move here, the second piece of the puzzle. Unsympathetic understandings. So we see them on a regular basis, we have interaction with them, we know what they're like. That leads towards what he describes as unsympathetic understandings. We can describe them better also, or we also know that those unsympathetic understandings as stereotypes. So, contact without fellowship leading to stereotypes or unsympathetic understanding, leading to ill will, generating the generation of ill will. So, we see them on a regular basis. I know what they're like. Those people are whatever. They're lazy, they're dirty, they're not like us in some kind of way. And then the fourth move is leading to hate walking. Prejudice. You know what they're like. We don't want them around, or I don't need to be in their presence. I don't want to be in their presence. That's prejudice. To generate ill will towards somebody based on whatever kind of impressions that you may have about them, or you may see about them in the news, or you may read about them in literature that's stunted towards or set up with a negative perspective on that people group or persons. That's all prejudice. Anybody can be prejudiced. Any people group, any persons can be prejudiced. You can be a minoritized person, a person of color, and prejudice. You can be a white person and prejudice. That's very different than racism. I shouldn't say very different. It's not racism. But racism can involve prejudice. So xenophobia and prejudice, two different vocabulary words, both different than racism. What is racism? Well, it may help to know a little bit of history. Racism is not very old. You may have different things throughout history, different times, moments in history, before the Enlightenment, before the 18th century and 17th century, where things look and sound like racism. But racism is a new anthropology in the Western world. The attribution of the category of race to human beings as a biological trait is new. Racism begins as the ideology to support the transatlantic slave trade. As Wendell Berry says in his book, The Hidden Wound, Europeans and colonists in America did not go to Africa because of race. They went to Africa because they could. Race became the ideology to legitimize the practice of slaving, selling and buying people of African descent. Race is the effort to create and to sustain systems and structures for whites only. It is the differentiation of bodies in the process of legitimizing white masculine property owners, creating that category of white masculine property owners, distinguishing between the slave and the slave owner. So it is a system that is constructed to define white over and against all others. You have peoples of color after you have what is really a full human figure, white landowners. Race is the differentiation of body types, the distinguishing of body types from white. And it begins in earnest in the process of legitimizing the practice of the transatlantic slave trade on American soil, most specifically. So, 17th century, the selling and buying of slaves picks up full steam in the colonies. And in the 19th century in particular, the scientists get to work. You can look the names up: Carl Linnaeus, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, Immanuel Kant, actually, who was more of an anthropologist than he was a philosopher, that we know him for his philosophy. David Hume. These men start writing the language of race. Carl Linnaeus used the term Homo sapien in his book Natural Systems for the first time. He actually gave us the term Homo sapiens when he was distinguishing four different types. Four, or perhaps it was five, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head now: Europeanus, Africanus, Asiaticus, Monstrous. Did I say Africanus? I'm doing this off the top of my head. the Linnaean taxonomy is what I'm describing. Well, this is why you cannot have reverse racism, because the category itself is the construct of various people types around an invisible and always present white norm. Now you can have prejudice, but race as a category, as we know it in the Western world, is a biopolitical organizing scheme set up around the construct of an invisible yet very present and necessary white normative humanity. The notion of white privilege is the creation of race itself. White is that privileged category. It is a political marker more than it is a skin type, a skin color. So there you have it. I look forward to the conversation with you all. There's a lot more to say here. I hope I've been clear.